I'm Bob Ferrara. I am on the steering committee too, as well. But my job right now is to introduce Kimberley Connors, an archaeologist and educator, in fact, a Harvard-trained archaeologist. She's been all over the world. She's been to Near East and all that stuff, you know, the wonderful Egypt and all. Yes, last year was Egypt. So cool places, but she's also spent a lot of time here in New England and a lot of time here in Acton, in our general region. She's helped to document trade routes, Native American trade routes in our area that were previously undiscovered, which were quite extensive, and maybe she'll get into that a little bit. She also founded Archaeology Outreach, which is a STEAM and cultural program, puts on STEAM and cultural identification programs. STEAM, I'm still getting used to it. Science, technology, engineering, arts. Arts is the new one. It's not just STEM. Arts and, yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yes. Okay. And so she's done a lot of work all over, but she's done a lot of work right here, even on Pine Hawk. She's also given talks for Pine Hawk in the past, and also the Discovery Museum, very popular. I remember going on a Great Hill Walk with you where you showed us all kinds of stuff. You need her eyes to know it's there, but it's there. So she's also an Acton resident. She grew up in Linfield, but she lived here for many, many years and contributed a lot to our cultural life, and still does. She was a member of the Acton Historical Commission. In fact, she was a prior chair before you, Bill, a couple ways back, and also the Ironwork Farm, which those of you in South Acton know, we should all know the Ironwork Farm. It's the Faulkner Homestead and Jones Tavern, very historic sites in South Acton. So with all that, I could keep going on a while, but I think they really want to hear from you, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Kim. So, thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Very sweet.
Remember the switching?
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank you, Bob. That was a lovely introduction. And also say that I am pleased and honored to be talking about archaeology and the timeline here in Acton. I'd like to thank Friends of Pine Hawk, the Acton Historical Commission, and Acton Memorial Library for entrusting me with this, as well as hi Mark from Acton Community TV. All right, so the basis of archaeology is that people leave occupational levels as they live on the land. Each level correlates with a specific time. At the surface, at the ground surface, you have the modern level, and as you move deeper down, you get farther back into history. As I tell the kids, I love my job. I get to travel back in time. Archaeology can be defined as the documentation of past peoples through material culture, typically thought of as artifacts, but it also includes architecture and occupational levels. An archaeological survey is a written report. Intensive archaeology can be done in one of two ways. You can do shovel test pits on a vector, every like 100 meters apart or less, depending. And then you can do excavations in highly concentrated areas. Typically, you find that after the STPs are done. The timelines that we're talking about today, there's a pre-contact occupation, which would be indigenous peoples only, and a post-contact occupation after Europeans came. And in Acton, we're counting that as 1600. We're going to Plymouth, basically. BP, before the present, easily, that's years ago. BCE is before the Common Era, what most people call BC, and CE is the Common Area. Archaeologists speaks their own language. We've got to provide a key so people understand what we're saying. There are specific sensitivity issues which will be talked about later. These were designated by the Acton Historic Commission that's missing, and it is the maps that Bill will show you at the end. So let's go back in time. After the glaciers receded, the earliest known human occupation in New England starts in what I'm calling the Paleo-Indigenous period. It is typically called Paleo-Indian. It starts about 12,000 years old. We don't have anything that early that has been found in Acton yet. Our timeline starts around the Middle Archaic. So the top one gives you a BP, years ago, before present, and then I've done a scale at the bottom giving the more common timeline that most people are used to seeing, the BC, which were before Common Era, BCE, and then Common Era. Here's Acton. It's pointing the wrong way. She should be pointing up. But this is how you fit it on a slide. A lot of what we're going to be talking about, some of it is very concentrated in certain areas during certain timelines, and some of it is everywhere. After, in the Middle Archaic, the climate warmed. It was drier than it had been. It was kind of like, tundra right after the glaciers. It was warmer and drier. I say always think Virginia. We had more of a mid-Atlantic climate at that point. The oaks and pitch pines stopped moving in, and they followed by the deciduous dwelling animals, your beaver, your deer, your turkey, ones we still have today. I saw some wonderful turkeys flying over Route 2 today. I don't know how they do it. And typically around rivers. And this too is how our first people living in what we now have as Acton, archaeologists typically call them in the Middle Archaic settlers, because they settle in. The earliest known site is Pinehawk that Bob was mentioning. So it's on Adams Street. If you don't know where it is, go take a look. It's so as you're going down High Street, it's the right-hand turn that connects to Maynard, and it was done in preparation for the Middle Fort Pond Brook sewer treatment plant, the one that's there now. And it was an intensive archaeological field work. They actually went in after doing the STPs. They did a lesser intensive one. They had a huge amount of artifacts show up. And it was determined that they would do one rescue season, which they did do. They finished in December of 1998. And this is the timeline we're looking at on that side. The earliest at 7,000 years ago. So we're going to have 7,000 years of history in 48 slides tonight, folks. That was, and it was the Middle and Late Archaic were the greatest occupation. Then there's a gap of 1,500 years where no evidence is shown. There could be numerous reasons for that, only one of which is that no one's at the site. There are many other reasons that is a possibility. Then you have, in the woodland period, you get low frequency of visitors, but still coming. And then in the contact period, there's only one group coming. And the pottery started to be using, the pottery shows up in the middle woodland period. So where am I talking about? There it is. How many people come to this area down here? There it is. So this, I put Stop and Shop in here so people will understand where it is. There's Stop and Shop. Okay, so here's the Assabet River. I am standing behind what used to be the last American great wine store or something like that. It is now Wellspring, Mass Wellspring, and I'm literally standing on the Maynard-Acton line. I'm taking a picture looking at the sewer treatment plant. That's where Pine Hawk was, literally right under it. And if you look the other way, you'll see the Maynard plant. I have a funny feeling it went that far, but we don't have evidence of that. Here's the powder mill. This is the powder mill pond on the Assabet. It's beautiful there. This is, I think, Monday night. I went down and took this picture. It's an absolutely lovely site. It has an elevation drop of 12 feet, which is good for fishing and good for power later on. I'll talk about that too. How sites tend to keep archaeology. If they have a footprint, they tend to continue to have one. And, there's our great blue heron. Can you see him there? There he is fishing. And here's our anglers. We have them out all the time. This is on the other side of the bridge, like on the Subaru dealership side, where the canoe launch is. So this is where the site was. They did intensive. It was done with 50, this is the gold standard of excavation. It was done by PAL, the Public Archaeology Laboratory, and Duncan Ritchie was the excavator, now retired and extremely respected archaeologist. I like that 7,666 registered find in an abbreviated year. That's a lot of artifacts. It was, as with most sites of, when you're looking at Native American sites, they tend to be on flat, south-facing location. They overlook a placid river, typically full of fish, clams with a falls. They're usually, because it's easier to get wares in that area. In this early period, it was sawgrass and twig rush that covered a floodplain. I have some here. And this not only attracted animals, but it's also excellent for making baskets and for mats. And it was a trade and transportation network, as Bob said. I've been working a lot on that. So I've gone over a little bit of this already. They all stopped in the same place for thousands of years. And even after a break, groups are still going back to it. This is a significant place to them. There's no question about it. And it probably also has a good, resources for hunting, fishing, and the other supplies you need to get through the winter and not starve to death. Hickory and hazelnuts were found in a storage pit, so that shows there were people there in the fall as well. We typically think of these sites as being spring sites because they work with the fish runs. The fish are we have three different type of fish that would have run and we're right in the middle of the season right now. By the end of June, it's gone. But we know that they were there in the fall as well. So I took that. I know that hickory and hazelnuts do not grow that close to the river. So I went looking for where I could find them. Bob was on this tour. And Great Hill, 3 miles away, where we have something in Acton we call the grinding stone, I interpret that as being a little more of a leaching stone, because some of these, to get the tannins out, not the acorns, there are different ways of doing acorns, but to get some of the tannins out, they would leach them in boiling water. So they would take, so this is speculation on my part, an interpretation, but we did find a pestle as the only stone ground tool. So, as we're about to go into the next time period, the woodland period, this is the one I think most people think of when they think of a pristine Native American environment. It was cooling. It was a cooling trend. They had a push for greater food storage and extensive pits and large roasting and smoking racks. So they were thinking about being able to save lots of food. Perhaps it's related to the climate cooling. That's speculation, though. By the late woodland, though, the climate is as it's now, and it has been with some variations ever since. This is when the large meadows start showing up, and I'll show you in some later slides. There is some evidence of burning the brush to get the meadows to grow, and corn is first imported into the region, a specific frost-resistant corn, and this information is from Curtis Hoffman, who is he's now retired as a professor at Bridgewater, but he very well respected Massachusetts archaeologist. So, one of the things here in Acton, grassy meadows all over. We still have some remnants, I'll show you in a few. This is when they started. And then Great Hill, which we still have named Great Hill. Fort Prom Brook used to be called Great Brook. And what is now the Erickson's Dam, originally the Faulkner or Jones Dam, was originally the Great Falls. It just doesn't seem to me that those are names that our English villagers would have given to these areas. That just, I don't know. It just struck me as I was doing this that there might be some kind of, there's no question that High Street was a Native American trail, as was Lost Brook. They were both Native American trails. And down Central Street out to Boxborough and Littleton, those were Native American trails as well. So this is a cultural survival cover from a few years ago. And the chief Cheryl from the Nipmuc, and you know, they didn't wander around. You know, they had a specific time and place to be in a specific area. It's like, you know, even after losing their title, they often went to the same areas at the same time. And it's just, you know, the modern concept of people just, oh, well, they're picking up and leaving. That was never, they knew, Native Americans knew where they were going. They knew where they belonged. They had a defined set territory. And people knew the Nipmuc were to the west of here. We are in the Massachusetts Confederation here as well, where you know, the Neshoba, Massachusetts. So, grassy meadows. In fact, we have a grassy pond conservation area. This is what started in the woodland period and still exists today. In fact, it was all over Acton. And on Neshoba Brook, I can see the parts where it was widened and cleared to make the grasses grow in. They liked the wet grasslands. It was an excellent place for fish and game and fowl. The birds would come to. And here in Acton, we still have some remnants of that. So archaeology tends to stay with the site. That is true. You know, like I showed the levels building up one on top of another, the things that draw different people to build in the same place and to do the same activities continue with as people change over time. The same impetus is there for them to be at a specific site. All right, as we make it through here. So in the definition by the Acton Historical Commission, post-contract is after 1600. It's so termed because of literally two cultures that have never met before meet for the first time. You can literally see it in the ground. They begin to immediately start interchanging artifacts and ideas on how to survive, because that's what it's all about again. Some of it is some people then archaeologists typically subdivide this into contact, colonial, and industrial, but it can also just all be called the historic period. Now, as contact happens, in 1640, we are part of Concord. Well, parts of Acton are. I'll explain that in a second. So the English village at Concord was, I've got a quote here from the Massachusetts Historical Commission, Archaeology Museum Online. What little of, so this, the sachem of Mestic, or the so-called squaw sachem, whose name was lost to history, continues to be lost. When her sachem husband, Nanapashimat, was killed in 1619, she assumed his title and the responsibility of governing her people, including Concord. She came to Concord to agree to the first sale of land. Well, I have some problems with this, such as that many of these societies were matriarchal. They still are. It is not unusual for women to have leadership roles in, I know in Deerfield, the indigenous community were forced to make sure they had males for the English to talk to, because they didn't get that women can have roles in this society. And she's also mentioned in the Concord town records, and we have they have a detailed listing of the sale. Now, I'm saying this only because Native Americans and English concepts of lands were opposed to one another. The people of Mesquitequid, which is what Concord was called, never thought they owned the land. They were the people of the land at Mesquitequid. Like the land itself was part of their family. It's a very different concept than the English who came wanting signatures and deeds and titles. Whether or not Native Americans knew at that time what they were signing away, I know later that the descendants of the Mesquitequid who went to Neshoba, they kept asking about the part to the east, and I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so here in Acton, we were partly Concord Village. Now, I'll get to the history of that in a second, but we know that there were English out here before they were supposed to be. They were out in, especially in North Acton, up where the Trail Through Time is. There is a concept, and I was taught that Native Americans never touched stone, that they did not have any kind of structural, infrastructure that we could see or study. And yet I found in the documents that water management, including earthidans and ditch systems, are documented, and by the Reverend Elliott, who started the praying villages, and reuse of native waterworks to power a saw, which I think happened all over Acton, and then unimproved land. So this is part of it, is that they were told, so the English were told that they could, have land grants of quote unquote unimproved lands. So it was beneficial for them to not mention areas that might have indigenous past, occupation or, infrastructure. Of course, as soon as, even before 1600, the populations had been decimated, and we don't know how many, but the estimates are up to 90% of the indigenous population had been killed by the diseases and various other ways that colonization destroyed their life and their lifestyles. So 2A follows a Native American trail. In fact, if you take it all the way out to the west, that was always called the Mohawk Trail because that's where the enemy came from. The Mohawk would come down there to do raids, especially in Boston. And Lawsbrook Road, I mentioned already, to School Street, to Central Street, and on to Summer Street, all a Native American trail that would go to the known villages. So I'd like to, Dan is here tonight. Thank you, Dan, for coming. And if you're interested more in the Neshoba Praying Village, this is Dan's book. And the one thing, I didn't know that part of Acton was actually in the village because of a change of border lines. And I'll show that slide in a minute. But the Native Americans were forced to Neshoba Village. It was, and in 1675, and then eventually to Deer Island in February 1676. And then after the genocide on Deer Island, Sarah Doublet was, she's referred to as Sarah Indian in the documents, and she was the sole signer when Neshoba was incorporated in 1713. After Sarah Doublet left trying, there were her and a few others that were trying to make Neshoba work, she went and lived at the Jones Tavern. And that is why the Jonesers ended up buying the land. Because at that time, if you didn't have a family to take care of you and your way of life, it would happen to women a lot, especially widows, but to Native Americans, you had to pay your way. And they would feed and board you with the expectation that you would sell them the land, because that is what, the Joneses were nice, they were good, don't get me wrong, but it was also an economic proposition. So here's Dan's slide, and there's that little strip right here. 150 feet of Acton is actually inside the Neshoba Praying Village since 18-something. when they were arguing over boundaries again. This happens a lot. And I know, like I said, so as I was going through my notes, it said that they kept asking about the area to the east. So east is right here, and this is, so here's Nagog, right? Here's Nagog Pond here, with half being in Littleton and half being in Acton. So the area to the east is North Acton. You can see there's Nagog there. And this boundary, I believe, is still existing. Yes, indeed. So the area to the east. Here in Acton, we recognize, appreciate, and preserve the sacred ceremonial stone landscape that we have, especially in North Acton, down Pope Road. It's probably more places as well. That's one of the things we'd like to get to know. Here, you can see in the middle, I don't know if you can see this glare, but the little 3 circles is an indication on the trail through time and on other conservation areas that there are what we were calling then stone piles. We're now calling them a ceremonial stone landscape there. I was out yesterday. Here I am at Spring Hill. Damn it, this thing's, and I took this one. I don't know if it's still visible. It's better without the trees, but that's the one that's the turtle effigy, and it's in a very prominent position. That's me on the side. I'm running walls here. I'm in the Neshoba Brook here, and this is on the trail through time, and I documented 13 different stone piles, which are now part of the trail through time. We also have intentionally disturbed ceremonial sites. And I don't get it. I just don't get it. I mean, why someone would do that is, I understand that there are people that are neo-pagans and other people that want to, honor the indigenous belief system that we believe the ceremonial landscape represents, but that's not the way to do it. Take some twigs or something and make a little wreath or something and put it near it, but don't touch it. It is an anathema to Native Americans. It's like desecrating a church, a synagogue, a mosque, or a temple. It is that serious. All right, now we move to the English side. So in the 1600s, Major Simon Willard was given a 1,000-acre grant for his work at the peaceful negotiation at Musketaquid for what would become Concord. He never actually used the grant here in town. I believe he sold it pretty quickly, a little less than 20 years. He sold it to the Ironwork Farm. Now, this was a separate plantation. It wasn't Concord, it wasn't Acton, it was its own thing. It has its own governing body, which was, it was like a hedge fund, is the only way, and they would have somebody's laughing, and they would come and they would have like economic things that people had to do. They tried to do bog iron like they did in Saugus. They had that kind of, they had a smaller forge first down at Parker Street where the railroad crossing is, right on the south side of it. And then they moved down to just south of the Damon Mill in West Concord. That was the last place that the furnace was located. It was a plantation, and it says to feed working people, yeah, but mostly it was to farm wood and turn it into charcoal to feed that furnace. And this is a boundary wall. This is right next to the train station. So you go out to the South Acton train station, and if you're looking up at Central Street, on the right-hand side, there's a 4-course boundary wall that I guarantee you is one of the boundaries of Ironwork Farm, and prior to that, Simon Willard. On the other side is surveyor's marks that are still used to this day that also date to that time. In fact, here is a surveyor's pile with a modern granite boundary marker in the middle. And people always say, aren't those stone piles just surveying, piles? It's a very different thing. When you look at the ceremonial landscape, it just, the minute I saw it, when I came to Acton, I just knew we were looking at something so different. I mean, I've worked on paleo sites above the notches in New Hampshire. I've worked at lots of contact sites and woodland sites. This is different. What we have here is a different thing. So that's what a surveyor is. A lot of people in Acton, a lot of their archaeology has got to do with surveying, because we've been surveyed about 1 million times, and we continue to be surveyed. Oh yes, that's another view of it. All right, so speaking of surveying, that is the measuring of distances using a compass bearing between known points, called datum in archaeology. We do the same thing. That's how we set our datum. A surveyor will circumnavigate the perimeter, and they go from known boundary to known boundary. In 1607, the rod measurement was actually established. It's all kinds of math going on here. And in the 1700s, the 2 poles were connected by a metal chain which had 100 links, and that was referred to as a rod. So if you're interested in your deed and doing a deed search or research on your own property, that's what you need to know, because that's the key to understanding the old surveying records, which a lot of them still have on the deeds. So on one side of town now, we have Ironwork Farm. On the other side of town, we were Concord Village. It's also was sometimes called the New Grants, because there was the original grant of 6 acres in 1635, and then they petitioned the Great and General Court in Boston, the legislature, the same people we still have now. Well, not quite, but you know what I mean. They petitioned for a larger tract of land. In particular, they said they wanted wet grazing areas. There are those wetlands again, those grassy wetlands, those meadows, wet meadows that started in the woodland period. Now the English want them. In 1642, Thomas Wheeler was the first official English person living here, and he grazed dry cattle, and I'm realizing that this picture is wet cattle. That means they make milk. Dry cattle we would call steers, which a lot of farms still have today. And Wheeler did actually improve the grant with a structure and a bond, and this site is on Concord Road. There's a cellar hole there, and it is archaeological evidence of this first English settlement in Acton. But then in 1666, more surveying's going on, and the new grants were surveyed by order of the General Court. Back on the other side of town, in the 1700s starts Mills Corner. So Ironwork Farm is sold, and it's sold to the Joneses. The Joneses get together, and they have a business partnership with Jonathan Knight. In 1702, they complete the dam. It's pretty close to being the same dam we have now. And they have mills on, so this is the Faulkner House here. And this is just a rendition. And this is Erickson's on the same footprint. And even though they had a fire in the 60s that took a lot of the buildings down, the substructures are still the same. In fact, if you look at them, so here's the top of the modern dam. We're looking down, and there is the drop. Here's where the wheel would have gone. It was a breast-fed wheel, which means it came in at, so the way it worked in New England is that all of the mills were sluice. We think of an overshot wheel where the water pushes the wheel down. It's not how it worked around here because we didn't have enough torque to do that. So what they would do is they would get a dam and they would store up the energy. They would take wooden sluices, like big orange crates as long as that there, and they would put water through it. Then it would hit, and in the breast one, it hits at the midpoint, right there. And therefore, it didn't need as much torque to move the wheel. And so it's still there. The wheel pit is still there, and you can see it on the riverside, on the brook side. The granite dam you see now is 1848. These are typical of the 1840s. When you see the granite dam, as soon as they started having pistons and they could cut the granite better, you start seeing them in both the architecture and the cellar holes, as well as in the dam technology, the mill technology. Okay, back on this side of town, now we're in the 1730s. So here in Concord Village, we didn't like traveling 7 miles to the meeting house, which is now where the First Parish, the UU Church on Lexington Road in Concord, that's where we would have traveled. And you either had to walk or somehow figure out, a way to get your horse and buggy. Well, no buggy, it would have been like a buckboard, more of a situation. It would have been more like a wagon down there and back. Most people walked. And they petitioned both to the Concord, the town of Concord, to become an official village with its own church. Or they've also petitioned to the Great and General Court to become a town. And I think they were hedging their bets. Let's see who happens first. But in the meantime, they started dividing the lots. Remember I said in 1666 they had that surveying done? Well, it took them 70 years to decide who was going to get the lots. And the lots were distributed, and I'm going to give a shout out here to Bell Choate, because I could never understand what this was without Belle's guidance. She and I would be on the floor with maps were flying. It was amazing. But the first division of lots, that was for 100 each, and each lot went to a certain family that had to be living in Concord at that earliest 1666 date. Then they did a second division of lots at 25 each for people that came in later, and then there was the third division in with the same thing. Is my basic understanding of this. It is hard to understand. There's no two ways about it, the way this works. I, of course, was looking at number 63, which is the Wheeler, where Wheeler Lane is, where Trail Through Time was. And many of the people that got these got these lots, they would buy other lots and try to get big tracts together. And Thomas, and now so this is a different Thomas Wheeler, this one's Lieutenant Thomas Wheeler in the 1730s. He was able to amass 600, so he had six big lots, first division lots, and some smaller ones too. He also, I think, is the guy that petitioned to become Acton. And he became our first town clerk in 1735. So this kind of thing leaves archaeological traces in the ground, by the way. All this surveying, you find things. And so in 1735, the meeting house was built right around the corner here. And the roads were built from outlying areas. And Main Street didn't exist yet, though, not till the 1800s. It's very interesting. Jones Tavern was built in 1732, and that was the first store here in town. And this is Robert Nylander's map, another shout out. He was able to put this together working at the Hall of Deeds in Cambridge, and being the most amazing historian there was. Another person whose work I stand upon, or shoulders I stand upon. So, the stone droving wall. So we're talking about roads now. There are a lot of abandoned roads in Acton, and they have archaeological significance, if nothing else, to be documented. And this is a droving wall up at, so the Lieutenant Thomas Wheeler site was sold to first the Gershom family, and then the Gershom widow married the Davies. And so the Davies is this. By now, we're at and they call him Davis in the record, but it's Davies on the deed. Welcome to looking at 18th century documentation. And so they were asking if they, would take a road, a section of a road. We still do it in town meeting. We're going to let a little bit of a road go. We're going to take a road. If someone's got a private road, then we're going to make it a public road. This is something that still happens on the warrant, and it's the kind of vote that no one actually has to vote on. It's like, oh, yeah, but they've been doing that from the beginning. And these roads are significant because it tells you things like there were outbuildings. There was a barn, where the sawmill formerly stood. You can figure out, and then 3 rods wide, which is the typical 3 rods wide is how wide these colonial roads were. I did a program here years ago about the similarities between ancient Rome and colonial Acton. that's part of it, is that there are designated things, and that's the way they are. So a lot of the documentation that we've been using here is in the conservation areas. They are full of archaeology. A lot of it has been documented, but we continue to do so and learn. But all of the outlying, the abutters, the adjacent lands, these are all areas that could be significant archaeologically. And of course, the stone chamber, which is also in, this one's in the Neshoba Brook. It's also as part of the Trail Through Time. It was literally a hole in the ground, and this was the first work that I did as chair of the Historical Commission, and I ended up being the liaison with my bucket and my trowel, and we used my little screens. These are all my buckets. I brought everything, and we did a proper excavation of all of the materials, because we had to totally reconstruct it and then reconstruct it, deconstruct it, and then reconstruct it to make it safe. And we only found one artifact right outside. It was a projectile point. We found no artifacts inside. It had a sandy bottom, and the interpretation was that it was used as an ice house, which there were a lot of ice houses here in Acton. We just got one documented, and a signage up right down at the Ice House Pond, as a matter of fact, on Concord Road. Whether or not it had a prior use is hard to tell sometimes, and this is one of those things that it might have been a reuse, but we can't tell. We can only tell what it was at that time. Foundations are everywhere. And that's something that we were just, when I left, the reason I left the Historical Commission is that I moved out of town. Everyone thinks I still live here. I come back here so often, but I currently live in Maynard. But there's no question that foundations, outbuildings, a lot of these things are not documented, and that is part of the reason why it's so important to understand the past uses of our land and to protect and preserve and document, and hopefully to protect and preserve. We don't know, but documentation is what we're doing. And then I've been missing a slide right here, because as we look at the Isaac Davis Monument, 1775 left a lot of archaeology around here too. At the Faulkner House, we had a survey done, and they found where the fire pits were. That the folktale was always, well, the men marched off to from Captain Faulkner's house, and the women and children made them meals, which they then sent with Francis Faulkner Jr. on his horse to go find the guys and to give them lunch. And we did find fire pits in the yard. We also found flints, mostly English, but we found one French flint, which I find fascinating. And granite. And it's a fitting monument to Isaac Davis, because we have a good history of quarrying around here. There's another archaeological evidence that we showed. There's Native American quarrying as part of the Trail Through Time. There's also the farmers. On the Faulkner House, we have granite that's been quarried right there in the yard. But the Arboretum has the same thing. And the monument came from right around the corner on Nagog Hill. So that was right here, and they quarried it. The big quarries were in North Acton in the 1800s. Oh, here we go. The most famous surveyor around here. This is Henry David Thoreau survey of Concord, Carlisle, Lincoln, Boxborough, Acton, Littleton, Stowe, Bedford from 1860. He also has a nice one of Great Hill that I couldn't find on the list. If you are interested in this type of thing, there's a great website from the Concord Free Public Library that you can go through all of his documents. But I love this one. This one's nice. And you can see, once again, see the vector lines from known points. And finally, we're in the 1840s, and the first railroad comes in. South Acton, the same railroad bed that the current commuter rail is on. That's the same one. It's been there since the 1840s. We know the workmen lived at the Jones Tavern. There is a tunnel somewhere that they covered up. I know where it is. And there is, some of it has definitely been saved with the Assabet Rail Trail, but there is still a railroad turntable out there that could definitely use a little help. By 1871, there were two, because there was also the Nashua Acton Boston Railroad, which I didn't even know existed. I knew North Acton had a station because the station master's house came up when I was, for development, when I was chair. But I didn't realize it was a different railroad until just the other day. Once again, all things that leave archaeological evidence, including the industrial era, the late industrial level, the era. There's all kinds of machinery you'll see. Here is what they're calling it, the River Street Dam now. We always called it the Shoddy Dam, Shoddy Mill Dam. That's coming down. And yeah, I was online. Yeah, it's I believe it. Part of it. Just part of it? Yes. Okay. That's all right, but so part of it's coming down. I was looking at the website, that's where I got that information. So part of it is being removed to do the flow of the brook. It's part of it's happening across the state, the reclamation of the original fish runs. And here's the pencil factory that's in the Showbrook, that's part of the trail through time. There were other pencil factories. There were pencil factories all over the place. There was a thing. And there's little Dugan McDuff showing us it's time to go home. No, he's gone now. But this is the end of my presentation. And I hope you enjoyed it.